The tension had been building for weeks, but nobody, not the economists, not the diplomats, not even the most seasoned political veterans on either side of the border, was fully prepared for what happened next. In a single sweeping announcement that sent shockwaves rippling through financial markets, government halls, and kitchen tables from Vancouver to Ottawa to Toronto, the White House unleashed a tariff package targeting Canadian goods so aggressive, so sweeping, and so immediate that it left trade experts scrambling to calculate the damage before the ink had even dried. Within minutes, the Canadian dollar trembled. Within hours, stock markets on both sides of the border were flashing red. Within a day, the entire global trading community had its eyes locked on one question: what would Canada do? The answer came faster than anyone expected. Standing before a packed room of journalists, advisors, and cameras broadcasting live to millions of Canadians from coast to coast, Prime Minister Mark Carney stepped up to the podium with a composure that, under the circumstances, seemed almost impossible. The room was electric. Aides were visibly tense. The weight of the moment pressed down on every corner of that chamber. And yet, what followed was not panic. It was not retreat. It was not the careful, diplomatic tap dancing that Washington had perhaps anticipated from a newly seated prime minister still finding his footing on the world stage. It was a declaration. Carney looked directly into the cameras, paused for just long enough to command complete silence, and delivered a response so measured, so precise, and so unapologetically firm that reaction videos began circulating on social media before his press conference had even concluded. He made clear, without ambiguity and without theater, that Canada would not be intimidated, that Canadian workers, Canadian industries, and Canadian sovereignty were not bargaining chips, that his government stood ready to respond with full force through every economic, diplomatic, and legislative tool available, and that those tools were already being prepared. Washington, by multiple accounts, did not see it coming at that level. Senior aides reportedly expected a softer opening position. Allies in European capitals were caught mid-conversation when the clips began flooding their feeds. Business leaders who had braced themselves for a prolonged period of Canadian hesitation were suddenly revising their assumptions. Even veteran observers of Canadian politics, people who had covered every major trade dispute going back decades, described Carney's tone as a marked departure from anything they had witnessed in recent memory. This was not Carney, the cautious central banker. This was Carney, the commander. The tariff announcement itself was staggering in scope. Covering a broad range of Canadian exports, the measures threatened to strike at the heart of industries that employ hundreds of thousands of Canadians, from auto manufacturing in Ontario to agriculture across the prairies to lumber and energy sectors that form the economic backbone of entire provinces. The numbers being quoted by analysts were not abstract. They translated directly into jobs, into livelihoods, into communities that have already weathered years of economic uncertainty and were now staring down a new and very deliberate storm. For ordinary Canadians watching from their living rooms, the mood was a complicated mixture of anger, anxiety, and, after Carney's response, something that surprised even seasoned political pollsters: pride. Social media in Canada lit up not with fear, but with fierce national solidarity. Hashtags surged. Clips of Carney's press conference were shared millions of times. In coffee shops, in offices, in factory break rooms, people were talking about what it meant, about whether Canada could hold firm, about what kind of country they wanted to be in the face of economic pressure applied by the most powerful office on earth. The diplomatic fallout extended far beyond North America. Within hours, allies in Europe were quietly signaling their support for Ottawa's position. Trade ministers in Brussels were on the phone. The United Kingdom, navigating its own complex post-Brexit relationship with Washington, found itself watching the Canada situation with intense interest, acutely aware that the pressure being applied to Ottawa today could find a different address tomorrow. Even countries with no direct stake in the Canada-US trade relationship were paying attention, because what was unfolding was not merely a bilateral dispute. It was a signal, loud, unmistakable, and globally broadcast, about the rules of international trade, about the willingness of the current White House to weaponize tariffs against even its closest partners, and about whether those partners would bend or hold. Canada, under Carney's stewardship, appeared to be choosing to hold. The economic stakes could not be overstated. Canada and the United States share the largest bilateral trading relationship on the planet. Hundreds of billions of dollars in goods cross that border every single year. Supply chains are so deeply integrated that a car assembled in Michigan might contain parts manufactured in 5 different Canadian provinces. Disrupting that relationship is not a surgical strike. It is a sledgehammer swung at a structure that both economies depend on, and the damage does not fall only on the side being targeted. Prices rise, factories slow, consumers on both sides feel the pinch. The irony of economic nationalism, as every trade historian will note, is that it tends to wound the nation wielding it almost as deeply as the one it aims to punish. But irony has rarely been a deterrent in moments driven by political momentum. And so the standoff hardened, the stakes climbed, and the world watched. What began as a tariff announcement ended as something far larger, a defining test of Canadian resolve, a moment that would be studied in trade policy classrooms for years, and the opening move in what promised to be the most consequential economic confrontation between two neighboring nations in modern history, with one prime minister refusing against every pressure applied to blink. There are moments in political history that arrive without warning, moments where the entire weight of a nation's character is compressed into a single room, a single podium, and a single voice. And what that voice chooses to say in those seconds determines not just the news cycle, but the national story for years to come. This was one of those moments, and Mark Carney did not waste it. When he walked into that press conference, the expectations were deliberately managed. Washington had calculated, as powerful offices often do when applying pressure to smaller economies, that a new leader still establishing his authority would hedge, would soften the language, would leave diplomatic room for retreat while projecting enough strength to satisfy a domestic audience. It is the oldest playbook in the politics of economic coercion. Apply pressure early, before a leader has consolidated power, before they have built the political capital to absorb the cost of confrontation, and watch them negotiate against themselves before the real talks have even begun. Carney did not negotiate against himself. What he delivered instead was a statement of national position so unambiguous, so deliberately stripped of diplomatic softening, that the people listening in that room, journalists, aides, foreign observers, took a collective breath. He was not performing toughness. He was not striking a pose for the cameras or deploying the kind of rehearsed defiance that experienced political watchers can identify from 100 meters. This was something different. This was a man who had spent decades in the highest rooms of global finance, who had sat across tables from the most powerful economic decision makers on earth, who understood better than almost any political leader alive exactly what these tariffs meant, exactly what the numbers translated into in human terms, and exactly what capitulation at this moment would cost, not just economically, but institutionally, generationally, and in ways that no future government would easily undo. He named it plainly. Canadian workers were not leverage, Canadian industries were not concessions waiting to be handed over. Canadian sovereignty, the right of an independent nation to chart its economic course without being bullied into submission by the threat of market punishment, was not a philosophical abstraction to be weighed against short-term convenience. It was, in his framing, the entire point, the entire reason the institutions existed, the entire reason the diplomats flew and the trade agreements were signed, and the relationships were maintained across decades of political change on both sides of the border. And then he went further. He did not simply draw a line. He made clear, with the kind of quiet precision that carries more menace than raised voices ever could, that his government had not arrived at this podium unprepared. The tools were not theoretical. The legislative mechanisms, the economic countermeasures, the coordinated responses being developed in partnership with allies, these were not future possibilities being floated as warnings. They were active preparations. The signal was unmistakable. Canada had done its homework. Canada knew exactly what it was willing to absorb and exactly what it was willing to deploy, and the calculation that Ottawa would flinch had been made in error. What struck observers most deeply was not the content alone, but the delivery, the absolute stillness of it, the refusal to be rattled by the enormity of what was being asked of a country that had for so long built its identity around peaceful cooperation with its most powerful neighbor. That stillness, that unshakable calm in the face of deliberate economic aggression, communicated something that no prepared statement could fully capture. Canada had found its footing, and it was not moving. There is a particular cruelty embedded in the architecture of these tariffs that goes beyond the numbers, beyond the percentages and the projected revenue figures and the trade deficit calculations that economists will debate in journals for years to come. The cruelty is in the targeting, because whoever designed this package understood exactly where to press, exactly which pressure points would generate the most pain with the most speed, and they pressed them all simultaneously, not with the blunt force of someone swinging blindly, but with the cold precision of someone who had studied the blueprint of the Canadian economy and circled, in red, everything that mattered most. Auto manufacturing in Ontario did not end up in the crosshairs by accident. This is an industry that represents not just employment numbers on a government spreadsheet, but entire communities, towns and cities whose identity, whose schools, whose local businesses, whose generational sense of purpose has been built around the plant at the end of the road. When that plant slows, the diner closes. When the diner closes, the family that ran it for 30 years makes impossible decisions. The damage does not stay inside the factory gates. It bleeds outward into every corner of the community it anchors, and it does so with a speed and thoroughness that recovery, even eventual recovery, never quite matches. The agricultural sector absorbed a blow that farmers from Saskatchewan to Prince Edward Island felt in their bones before the analysts had finished reading the fine print. Agriculture in Canada is not simply an economic category. It is a way of life, a relationship with land and season and labor that stretches back generations, that has survived drought and flood and market collapse and come back, because the people who work that land are constitutionally incapable of walking away from it. What tariffs do to that world is not merely financial. They disrupt the fragile calculus of planting seasons and futures contracts and cooperative agreements that farmers spend entire winters carefully constructing, and they do so with a suddenness that leaves no room for adjustment, no space for the kind of gradual adaptation that resilient industries can usually manage. Lumber and energy, the twin pillars of resource based economies across British Columbia, Alberta, and the Northern Territories, found themselves staring at measures that threatened to choke off the export pipelines that entire provincial budgets depend on. These are not marginal industries. These are the revenues that fund hospitals, that pay for highways, that keep the lights on in communities so remote that no alternative economic engine exists or could realistically be constructed in any time frame that would prevent catastrophic disruption. Strip away those export revenues and you are not adjusting a line on a balance sheet. You are pulling a structural beam from a building with people still inside it. What made the scope of this tariff package so staggering to those who spent the first hours after the announcement trying to model its full impact was the sheer interconnectedness of the damage. These industries do not exist in isolation. They feed into each other, supply each other, depend on each other in chains of economic relationship so deeply woven into the fabric of Canadian commerce that pulling on one thread tightens the entire weave. A slowdown in auto manufacturing reduces demand for steel. Reduced steel demand hits the energy sector. A struggling energy sector pulls investment from infrastructure. Infrastructure delays slow agricultural logistics. And somewhere in the middle of all that cascading consequence, the human cost accumulates quietly, relentlessly, in ways that never fully appear in the headline figures, but are felt with devastating clarity by the hundreds of thousands of Canadian families standing directly in the path of it. What happens between two nations is never truly contained between two nations. That is the first lesson of modern economic history, and it is a lesson that the architects of globalization spent decades embedding into the infrastructure of international trade precisely because they understood what the alternative looked like. They had seen it. The tariff wars of the early 20th century did not stay politely within the borders of the countries that started them. They spread, they deepened, they accelerated a global economic collapse that rewrote the political map of the entire world. The institutions built in the aftermath, the agreements, the frameworks, the multilateral bodies designed to ensure that no single nation could again weaponize trade without consequence, were not bureaucratic exercises. They were scar tissue. They were the architecture of hard-won collective memory. That memory was very much alive in the capitals, watching Ottawa and Washington square off. In Brussels, the reaction was not merely sympathetic, it was strategic. European trade ministers understand, with a clarity born of their own ongoing negotiations with an increasingly transactional White House, that the precedent being set in this confrontation will not stop at the Canadian border. If the message being sent is that longstanding alliances, deeply integrated supply chains, and decades of cooperative trade relationships can be casually overridden by unilateral tariff action whenever a domestic political calculation makes it convenient, then every nation that trades with Washington has just received a warning addressed in part to them. The phones in Brussels were not ringing out of solidarity alone. They were ringing because European capitals were watching this confrontation as a preview of their own potential future, and they were paying extremely close attention to how Canada responded. The United Kingdom, navigating its uniquely exposed post Brexit position, found itself caught in a particularly uncomfortable tension. London needs Washington. It has invested enormous political capital in the promise of a bilateral trade deal that would validate the economic logic of leaving the European Union. And yet, London also watches Canada, a Commonwealth nation, a Five Eyes partner, a country with whom Britain shares not just historical ties, but active intelligence and defense cooperation, being subjected to economic pressure of a kind that sits uneasily with every principle of allied partnership that the post war international order was constructed upon. The silence from Downing Street in the immediate hours after the announcement was not oversight. It was the sound of a government doing very difficult arithmetic. Markets, as they always do, translated the geopolitical anxiety into immediate numerical reality. The movements were not subtle. Investors do not react to nuance. They react to uncertainty, and what this confrontation injected into the global economic atmosphere was uncertainty of the most destabilizing kind. Not the uncertainty of a natural disaster or an unforeseen crisis, but the uncertainty of deliberate policy, which is, to a market, far more frightening because it carries no natural endpoint, no recovery timeline, no moment at which the disrupting force simply exhausts itself. Deliberate policy can persist, it can escalate, it can be doubled down upon for reasons that have nothing to do with economics and everything to do with politics, and markets cannot model political will with any reliability. What made this standoff historically significant was not simply its scale, but its symbolism. The United States and Canada do not merely trade with each other. They are woven together at a level of economic intimacy that no tariff schedule can fully capture. Sharing infrastructure, energy grids, water systems, defense commitments, and a border so long and so open that its very existence has always been the most powerful argument for what cooperative international relationships can achieve when built on genuine mutual respect rather than the cold arithmetic of leverage. What the world witnessed in those extraordinary hours was not simply a trade dispute between two neighboring nations. It was something far more profound, far more consequential, and far more revealing about the state of the international order than any single tariff announcement could contain on its own. It was a moment where the assumptions that have quietly governed the relationship between power and partnership for decades were suddenly, publicly, and irrevocably placed under examination, and where the outcome of that examination would send a signal whose frequency would be detected in every capital, every boardroom, and every household that depends on the stability of the global trading system. Canada entered that moment carrying an enormous weight. The weight of an economy targeted with surgical precision. The weight of industries that employ hundreds of thousands of people, whose livelihoods did not ask to become instruments of geopolitical leverage. The weight of a newly seated prime minister being tested at the highest possible level before the world's most unforgiving audience. And the weight of a national identity, peaceful, cooperative, internationally respected, that had never been asked quite so directly to decide where cooperation ends and capitulation begins. What Carney chose to carry back out of that moment was something different. Something that no economic model had predicted, no political playbook had fully prepared for, and no amount of pressure from the most powerful office on earth had been able to compress into submission. He carried out resolve. The kind of resolve that does not arrive loudly or dramatically, but settles into a room with the quiet authority of absolute certainty. The kind that tells everyone watching that the person standing at that podium has already done the hard internal work, has already counted the cost, has already made the decision that cannot be undone, and is simply informing the world of what has already been determined. The global community absorbed that signal with a speed and seriousness that spoke to how deeply the stakes were understood beyond North America's borders. Allies rallied not merely out of friendship, but out of self preservation, recognizing that the line being drawn in Ottawa was in many ways being drawn on their behalf as well. Markets reacted not merely to the economic disruption, but to the dawning recognition that the rules they had priced into every contract, every forecast, and every long term investment strategy were being contested at their very foundation. And ordinary people in Canada, in Europe, in every nation that has ever had to calculate the cost of standing firm against overwhelming pressure, watched and felt something stir that goes beyond politics and policy and the dry language of trade economics. Because at its core, what this confrontation revealed was a truth that economic history has confirmed again and again across centuries of commerce and conflict, that the nations which endure are not necessarily the largest or the wealthiest or the most heavily armed, but the ones that understand what they are willing to defend, who communicate that understanding without flinching, and who back their words with a preparation so thorough and a conviction so deep that even the most powerful adversary is forced to recalculate the cost of continuing to press. Canada, in those defining hours, showed the world exactly who it was, a nation that had been targeted precisely because someone believed it would bend, and that responded by making absolutely certain, in language that required no translation and admitted no misreading, that the calculation had been catastrophically wrong. And in the end, that is what nations are truly made of. Not their resources, not their geography, not the size of their economy or the reach of their military, but the irreducible decision, made in the hardest possible moment, to stand exactly where they stand and refuse, with every instrument of national will available, to be moved.